Photoshop has some really nice ways to isolate an object. This is the advanced users selection methods. So we're going to look at how to isolate an object in Photoshop. The goal in isolating an object is to use your knowledge of Photoshop, pick the best tool, and then select the object. Then we want that selection to go into a new layer so we can manipulate it and run all of our effects to create our ideal composition. So the extraction tools allow us to define an area or an object that we want to extract and then delete those non-extracted portions to transparency. Most of the methods start with an active selection. I'm going to focus with this lesson on the refine edge to extract. This is something fairly new around CS5. Some smart technologies began to be put into these extraction methods, and you'll see it can do some really neat things. Now, this really works well with selections that are with fur or with hair, those irregular, really hard selection areas. If I were to just use a selection tool, I'll end up cutting out some of that flyaway hair and making it look as though they have like a hairnet on. You know, it's the smooth head that looks unrealistic. Same thing with animals, with fur. To start with, we are going to make a selection, and you can utilize either the Magic Wand tool or a quick selection tool. I'm going to use my quick selection tool here. And again, two different ways that you could do this selection. I could click in the background here and get the background image, which this isn't too bad, and then do a select and do an inverse and get my actual subject. This worked fairly well. Control D to deselect. I could go right into my subject here. When I do this, the arm of this person behind tends to get selected because it's really similar to those colors. And so this is where I can use my shift click or my option or alt click with my selection tools. I'm holding down my alt or option key to delete certain areas here. Okay. So now that we have our selection, the thing to remember here with the extract, the refine edge tool, is that the details are not so important at this stage, which sounds really odd, but the less that you select, the better Photoshop will actually do here. So we're talking about the areas right around the flyaway hair, and we'll call those the areas of transition. Okay. One thing I want to do before I enter into my Refine Edge dialog box is to convert my layer from a background layer to a regular image layer. The only reason I'm going to do that is because some of my output options from this Refine Edge box will not be available when I have a locked background layer. So double click, I'll just go with the default layer 0. Now I am good. So two methods that we can get to this Refine Edge dialog box. The long way first, go under your select menu and Refine Edge. There's a quick key combo here that you can also select. The fast way is right up here in the options bar. So when you have a selection tool active, you are going to see the Refine Edge. We'll click on that, and here's my Refine Edge dialog box. Looks fairly simple, but there's some pretty complicated things that can happen here. So in the Refine Edge, the very top here, I see a view mode. So the view mode basically just changes the way that we see the selection. It's how that selection is displayed. I can go from marching ants, so I see my full layer, and just with marching ants, that's how I actually entered in. Overlay. Notice each one of these has a quick key as well. On black or on white. Black and white, so we're viewing it as a mask. This sometimes is the preferred way. On layers and reveal the layer. You can also press F to cycle through each one of these views. So let's go to the black and white you can see that I have a fairly smooth, solid edge here. And what I want to do is capture those flyaway hairs to make this look more realistic. Now the show radius up here, this is nice. And if I have drawn a radius, I will see that area of transition. We'll come back to that because I don't see that at the moment. The edge detection here. So we can automatically detect the edge. It determines the size of the region around the selection. The higher the radius, look at what happens here. The more hair is becoming selected. So the higher the radius here, the more area of transition. But notice that I'm also getting areas around the clothing and in the back. And I don't really care for that. And so what we can do is turn on the Smart Radius. Helped a little bit. And again, this is really going to be different from photo to photo. So there's not just one, step-by-step textbook method of doing this. It's all going to be really determined by the kind of background that you are using. What Smart Radius does in this edge detection is that as I move the slider, it looks at the area of transition a little bit differently. It should intelligently know that smooth borders, and it's having a little bit of trouble here, but typically if you've got something absolutely smooth, it would know that that area, that radius, which is that area of transition, would be smaller, and where areas like the hair would be actually larger. Good rule of thumb, just keep it checked all the time, okay? Now, if I started with something like this, I would go to my Just Edge and work here first. So usually when you're using the Adjust Edge, you haven't really done anything else. The Adjust Edge adjusts the edge. So smooth reduces those irregular areas. This isn't really what I want. See how it's smoothing it out? If I go extreme here. So it's actually smoothing out the selection. In reality, it's not too helpful because that is not what I want. I'm going to bring that back down to 0, and most of the time you're just going to leave that one alone. Feathering creates a softened edge of transition. See how it feathers it? Sometimes this will be needed because photos aren't always absolutely crisp at the edges. So this makes the edge softer or a little bit more fuzzy. And you might need to use this feather initially if the edge is just too crisp. Okay, so if it's just really, really too tight, we can feather it just a bit. Okay, usually feather and then we have contrast. These two sort of work hand in hand. So this sharpens up the edge selections. Contrast makes it a bit sharper. Okay, see how it's very, very sharp here as I drag this higher. So it firms up the radius a little bit. So a lot of times you might have to do a little bit of feathering, and then you might go and increase the contrast a bit. And Shift Edge shrinks or enlarges. So as I drag here, it's expanding it or it's shrinking it. This works really well if you're using these other tools. This works good if I have that white halo. Sometimes you end up with a white halo around the edge, so you can pull the edge into the subject, bringing it down a little bit and try to eliminate that halo. Okay, I'm going to take these all back to 0 here and I'm going to go back to 0, and I can type into a number here. We are going to look at the tools here. So a lot of times this is the tool that you're going to use, and there are two tools, Refine Radius tool and the Erase Refinements tool. The Erase Refinements tool undoes the Refine Radius tool, so it's like your undo. This tool allows us to paint the radius, and we have complete control. You want to, again, keep Smart Radius checked when you do this. I'm going to keep this crisp here, and now watch what happens as I drag around. I'm going to actually view this on, well, maybe white is best here to show you what's going on. So I'm dragging with this Edge Radius tool, and when I let up, look at how that hair comes out. Okay, so it's determining what should be out and what should not be. Now here it had a little bit of issue, so I might go back and erase that. But I can have a larger brush using my square bracket tools, make this area be larger, and of course keep smaller in the tight areas. And look at how easy that is to get some of that hair back. The flyaway hair is now coming back. We want all of that. Okay. Now down here we have a decontaminate colors. And this is, the hair color, we're going to look at those finest details that expands out and it pushes the color out there. So the detail comes up in those finest areas. If I do that and check, you might, there you can see a little bit of that color being pushed out versus see how the fading in is happening with my coloring. So pushing this out lets that full hair color go out so that it looks like the true hair there. The output here, this lets me output to different situations. I can do a new layer. I can do a new layer with layer mask. I can do a new document with layer mask. And I should be able to see selection and layer mask. If you've not converted it to an image layer and a regular layer, then this may be grayed out. So we'll do just a new layer with the layer mask. I'm going to go back here and clean up a little bit in this area here to make that more tight. Okay, so I can go back and look at this mask. Okay, and of course you can play with these settings a little bit if you'd like. I can play with my edge. I can feather this out a little bit if I want. I can play with my smart radius. But the fact that I drew on here, you're probably going to be pretty good. And so if I click OK, there you go. So a little bit of transparency coming in here, not exactly what I wanted. Probably refining that radius and that area of transition to a little bit smaller would be helpful. But now I can put this on a different background and that hair is coming out. Excellent way to, like I say, mask or make selections.